Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Napoleon and the legendary black general Thomas-Alexandre Dumas by History Dose. The story of Dumas is a very interesting one, and through it we can learn many things about the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video. Alright, History Dose. We've done a bit of their content before.
The white sun corrupted the mind, shriveled the throat. Men broke ranks and made their graves in the sand. What madness had driven them into this desert?
Napoleon.
General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas still asked himself that question. Whether incipient ideals of liberty had corralled 50,000 Frenchmen into this ancient land, or merely the blind ambition of their general-in-chief, Napoleon Bonaparte.
This is Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, something that we haven't covered much on this channel, though I would absolutely love a video or a video series on that expedition, a very interesting time in Napoleon's career. Not as successful as some of his other expeditions or campaigns, but still fascinating.
General Dumas felt the time to rebel was near.
Yes. And Dumas plays an interesting role in Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Alright, part 1, The Count. Yep. The French colony of Haiti.
Antoine David de la Paiterie was still hiding. Old debts and familial quarrels had pushed him to the backwater streets of western Saint-Domingue 3 decades ago. French-born whites like himself and free people of color populated the colony, staked their livelihood in a Haitian soil that so abundantly sprouted coffee beans and sugarcane.
Yeah, Haiti is a fascinating topic. Once again, one that we haven't really covered on this channel, but really, really interesting. Of course, how Haiti ties to France, the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution, and then Haiti under Napoleon. There's a whole lot of fascinating stuff. At this point, Haiti is a French colony. It runs on slave labor. The vast majority of people living on that island are enslaved Africans. But the island also has a population of whites and mixed-race people, people of color. And there are the white plantation owners. There are also other white individuals who might be more middle class. They might be merchants. Maybe they run a shop. Maybe they're a farmer themselves. And then, as I said, we have the mixed-race community. Some of them are planters who own slaves in their own right, and some of them are also more middle class. But it's always worth remembering, like I said, the vast majority of people on that island are slaves.
The harvesting of which depended on 500,000 African slaves who lived every day in hell, 12 hours a day under a scalding sun and searing whip.
And Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, I'll just call it Haiti, was an extremely profitable French colony, produced a lot of coffee and sugar, these really valuable cash crops that, of course, were very popular in Europe. And, of course, the slavery throughout the Americas was horrible and brutal, but the conditions were particularly bad somewhere like Haiti. It was very dangerous, the conditions were bad. If you were enslaved on a Haitian plantation, your life expectancy was very, very short, even compared to slave plantations in other colonies throughout the Americas. So, just a really horrible condition to be in.
As Europe demanded sweetened tea and powdered pastries, plantation owners found it more profitable to import new slaves than to provide for ones they had already purchased. So here in Haiti, slaves were simply worked to death.
And that's the thing, that's why it was so brutal. If you look at, say, slavery in the United States, in the southern states, now still extremely brutal, and a lot of slaves died prematurely, but the planters found it in their interest to at least try and keep their slaves alive, because it was so expensive to purchase another enslaved person. Sort of a horrible economic logic, right? Still terrible. But if you look at Haiti, they were constantly importing more and more enslaved people, and so the planters, the owners, they didn't really care about preserving the lives of the enslaved people on their plantations, because to them it was more profitable to just purchase another slave, bring someone in. And so, the terrible conditions plus being worked to death, this is why it was so especially horrible to be enslaved on a Haitian plantation.
Antoine had purchased his slave to be his live-in concubine. Marie Sisset bore him several children over the years. Now, having learned a great family inheritance awaited him in France, Antoine sold her and his daughters to another man.
Yep, and this is something that was common in Haiti and throughout the slave societies of the Americas at this time. There was a lot of sexual assault that would happen, where these planters, the masters, would sexually assault the enslaved women, and they would have children. And oftentimes they would keep their own children in slavery. Truly a horrible, horrible system.
To gain passage to France, he pawned his 13-year-old son, Thomas-Alexandre, into slavery. The boy never again saw his mother or sisters. After a year of enslavement, Thomas-Alexandre took his first steps on European soil, a kingdom of winding chateaus and cliffside gardens. His father was eager to mold him into a proper count. Mornings in the academy were reserved for philosophy, literature, mathematics, evenings for horseback riding and swordsmanship. In the latter pursuit,
Though, it's worth pointing out that in comparison to, say, the United States, like I mentioned, stuff was a little different on Haiti. And as I said, Haiti had this mixed-race population, some of them who owned slaves themselves. So, there absolutely still was this racial hierarchy on the island, but it was a little bit different than it was in the U.S. And so, we can sort of see that difference come into play here, where a black man, like Thomas-Alexandre, as we might say in English, is being raised a little differently than a black man would be in the southern United States.
Thomas-Alexandre trained under the celebrated Chevalier de Saint-Georges, the mixed-race polymath, a royal composer and the finest swordsman in Europe. White students watched with envy as the muscular Thomas-Alexandre impressed in bouts with Saint-Georges.
Yeah, and we see another mixed-race individual there. We'll see at this time there is a bit more mobility for people of color in somewhere like France. A bit. Highlight on that. Still a lot of racism, a lot of barriers to advancement. But, like I said, if we compare it to, say, the southern states of the United States with the intense racial hierarchy that they had, France is a bit more open to a person of color entering a high position in society. It's all relative.
But both teacher and student were losing their footing in high society. The European idea that physical attributes could constitute a race, which in turn conferred certain competencies, every day crystallized as slavers pushed millions of stolen Africans onto westward ships.
Yep.
Europeans defended their inhumane treatment of Africans by professing their subhumanity. The Black Code had defined French regulations around slavery, how runaway slaves should have their ears removed and hamstrings cut. Now the King of France, Louis XVI, outlawed mixed marriages and mandated that all people of African descent apply for special identification.
So we can see that there was still some room for the racial hierarchy to move and change, and in fact, it was getting worse as ideas of race were becoming more entrenched in French society. There was still this debate going on between people who are pushing these ideas, and of course some people who were arguing against them. But the tide seemed to be moving in the wrong direction for people like Thomas-Alexandre and his fencing coach, who were these people of color, fully black or mixed race, I think more often than not mixed race, who had reached positions in society, fairly high or moderate positions in society. These positions would be challenged by, this growing sense of entrenched racial hierarchy.
Still, Thomas-Alexandre cut a striking figure among the noble class, a powerful 6'1" in a time when the average male height was roughly 5'5". The young nobleman reveled in Parisian high life. Paris was a flickering lamppost, carriage rides to the theater, stiff corsets, and powdered wigs. A metropolis of half-starved peasants and horse dung caked into sidewalks.
Oh yes.
It was here that
Paris was a place, especially at this point, of great highs and great lows. It was a city that was very stratified. In many ways, it was grimy, dirty, impoverished, but some parts of the city were grand, wealthy, and impressive, so it was certainly an interesting place to be.
Thomas-Alexandre escorted a white woman to the theater, where a naval officer cut in, flirted with his date, and said to Thomas-Alexandre, "In your country, they put chains on your feet and on your hands."
Damn.
When he returned an insult, the man's friends tried to force him to kneel and ask for forgiveness. Both men were briefly arrested. Antoine, meanwhile, had developed an obsession with the procurement of fine gems and jewelry, and soon, at over 70 years old, Antoine wed his housekeeper in her early 30s. Thomas-Alexandre made no effort to attend the ceremony, and Antoine promptly restricted funding to his son's Parisian lifestyle. Thomas-Alexandre thus set out on another path.
Very interesting. Once again, a sort of different relationship than you might see in the United States, where if you were a planter who had children with one of your slaves, it would usually remain more under wraps than that. There would be a lot less recognition, if any recognition. Of course, there's different examples, but usually would not have been as open as Thomas-Alexandre's relationship with his father was. All right, Chapter 2, The Soldier.
A troubling force stirred in France. Famine and storm ravaged her peasantry, and the crown, drained from its involvement in the American Revolution, neglected to answer their cries for aid. Rather, King Louis XVI sought to levy a harsh tax on exclusively the common people, whose marginalized representatives forcefully responded by founding their own legislative body. In clamorous riots, commoners and aristocrats called for liberty and republicanism, questioned the sanctity of monarchy, and felled the symbols of the old order. The king had little choice but to concede the validity of their legislative assembly. In the heat of revolt, violent opportunists also roamed the countryside, setting ablaze elegant estates and robbing and slaughtering noble and common folk alike.
Yeah, well, we have sort of this great fear, as it's known, where all this action is going on in Paris, and a lot of people are afraid that there's going to be some counterattack from the king and the nobility. The royalists are going to bring in an army to put down this revolution. And so throughout the countryside, people are afraid, and they basically go for a preemptive strike. They take the fight to their local nobility. They burn chateaus, they steal, they murder, and of course, a lot of this is tied up with, just basic banditry and opportunists. So it's some combination of fearful peasants, peasants getting revenge for treatment in the past and taking what they feel they deserve, basic banditry, and, like you pointed out, opportunists.
Troops were called to safeguard these lands. Some miles north of Paris, a soldier rode into town, navigating unsteady cobblestone with an upright air of refinement. Though a lowly private, the man who now called himself Alex Dumas guarded his honor with vigilance. He had recently dueled 3 fellow cavalrymen and defeated them all. His father...
And so Dumas, of course, as we saw, he was born in Haiti, but as the French Revolution kicks off, he is in France. So he's sort of in a unique position. I mean, we can go back to Haiti, and I'm not sure if we'll touch on it again in this video. Of course, they have their whole own thing going on. You see the development of the Haitian Revolution and all this conflict between the white residents of Haiti and the mixed-race people and the enslaved black people, and all this stuff is happening. Dumas is in France. So, like I said, he's back in the French Revolution, in that sort of center of action.
Antoine had died a few weeks after he enlisted. Alex Dumas had hoped to join as an officer, as nobles did, but the color of his skin served to undermine his noble bloodline. In town, Dumas lodged with the innkeeper, Claude Labouret, and his family. In the coming months, he regaled his hosts with courtly manners. Their 20-year-old daughter, Marie-Louise, was infatuated. Long conversations with his hosts revealed a shared enthusiasm for the revolutionary government, which now declared the inalienable rights of all citizens. Dumas eventually asked his host for his daughter's hand in marriage, and Claude Labouret obliged on the condition that Private Dumas obtained at least the rank of sergeant. 10 days later, Dumas left behind his fiancée to continue on the warpath.
And we mentioned the inalienable right of all men. That was not extended to women, by the way. You can sort of see why this proved an inspiration for many in France and back in Haiti. Many people of color who said, now wait a minute, inalienable rights of all, does that include us? And of course, a lot of the white planters on Haiti said, absolutely not. But, when people get that idea, they want to start fighting for themselves. And so the revolution inspired a lot of people, though, of course, it gets very complex, bloody, there's ups and downs, it's a lot more complicated than, those foundational ideas. But despite all that happens, those ideas are still important to people.
The revolution was in full swing. Its most vocal devotees endeavored to topple and reconstruct what they viewed as an unjust society. In the succeeding years, the assembly abolished the nobility and forced the clergy to swear allegiance to the state. The king attempted to flee Paris and spark a counter-revolution to restore himself as an absolute monarch. He was recognized and arrested. The people denounced Louis as a traitor, so the legislative decision to allow him to retain his throne in a constitutional monarchy sparked uproar. Dumas and his cavalry stormed into Paris to manage hostile crowds at the Champ de Mars. Here he witnessed national troops under Marquis de Lafayette open fire on protesters in a massacre.
Yeah, this was not a great moment, Of course, we have this revolution where the people are rising up against the royalist government. The king has just been caught trying to flee the country with his wife, the Queen Marie Antoinette. Both of them are in correspondence with the Austrians, and they basically want help taking back their country from the revolutionaries. So a lot of people are very upset. And then on the Champ de Mars, we have this situation where, people are protesting, and then, these revolutionary troops, the National Guard, fire on this crowd. That's an interesting position to be in, because these are revolutionaries firing on other revolutionaries. But of course, you start to see sort of the separation and breakdown of these revolutionary groups. Some of them are moving further to the left, away from constitutional monarchy towards republicanism, and some of them are trying to stay closer to the middle, or sort of a more moderate liberal position.
But this irrepressible call for liberty and equality now echoed beyond France. In Saint-Domingue, the island of slaves revolted.
Great. Back to Haiti, I'm glad.
Mobilizing the very ideals espoused by the French Revolution. But as in America, a doctrine of liberty had been raised alongside a lucrative tide of racial prejudice, which sought to define precisely who deserved inalienable rights.
Yeah, And of course, there's a lot of questions in academia about, to what extent what occurred in Haiti was influenced or caused by the French Revolution itself, and to what extent these events were caused by local conditions. Obviously, it's some sort of mix. It's just your opinion, what you think is more or less influential. But you have this interesting situation where you have these white planters on Haiti who initially are more pro-French Revolution. They think that they'll be able to secure more rights for themselves, secure autonomy for their colony. But of course, there's a sort of inherent contradiction. They're fighting for these inalienable rights for themselves, but not for the vast majority of people who they are holding in slavery. I mean, obviously, we can look at the United States for the same contradiction. A lot of these southern slave owners fighting for freedom and liberty, yet holding people in bondage. And so, over time, and remember, Haiti is, the vast majority of the population is enslaved. Even more so than a lot of these southern states. And so, as time goes on, and these ideas start spreading amongst, at first the white planters, then the broader white population, and then the free black and mixed race population, and then they spread to the enslaved people. Well, when people hear about this idea of inalienable rights, they say, well, these rights ain't just for you, they're for me too. And people start fighting for racial equality, and the enslaved people start fighting for their own freedom. And that's how we get to this position.
The legislators of France refused to abolish slavery or bequeath their fruitful Haitian colony. They were presently concerned with the nagging presence of Louis XVI. The king used his remaining authority to block their attempts at radical reform, and Prussia and Austria threatened violence should any harm befall him.
Yep.
The French National Guard responded by storming the king's palace in 1790.
Yeah, well, Prussia and Austria must have felt like, we're going to threaten these radicals and tell them, if you hurt the king, we will rain fire down upon you. That'll stop them. Of course, that had the exact opposite effect. The French radicals were enraged that these conservative monarchs should tell them what to do in their own country. And, that makes them even more radical.
92. They killed his Swiss guards, locked Louis in a dungeon, and abolished the monarchy.
Long live the Republic!
The move stoked armed conflict with surrounding kingdoms, who threatened to restore monarchical order in France. On these battlefields, Alex Dumas began to make a name for himself.
And here we have the emergence of the French Revolutionary Wars, which will go on for years and basically dovetail into the Napoleonic Wars. So we have a couple of decades of warfare coming up, a couple of decades in which the traditional, military hierarchy has already been upended. Most of your officer corps, the nobility, has fled the country. So there are a lot of positions opening, and as more troops are raised and more people die in combat, there are constantly more and more opportunities available to people, like our friend Dumas, who is, looking for those opportunities.
In the daring rush of cavalry. He received an invitation from an old friend. Chevalier de Saint-Georges had founded the Black Legion, a free army of black and mixed-race soldiers, and he entrusted Dumas to be his second in command.
Wow.
In daily charges, Dumas cut down enemy troops and took many more prisoner. He often shouldered the de facto command of the Black Legion, as Saint-Georges and the other officers spent much of their time in Paris, boozing and socializing.
So Dumas out there cutting his teeth in the field of battle, getting some real experience.
In time away from the front, Dumas returned to the countryside and at last married Marie-Louise. Only a couple of months later, the latest iteration of the French Parliament voted on the fate of their deposed king. In January of 1793, Louis was publicly beheaded.
Yep.
War continued.
And, founding the Republic, abolishing the monarchy was pretty popular. At least it had momentum at the time. It would come to be regarded a little differently, but the execution of the king, that was far more narrow. The vote to execute the king was extremely close, and throughout the country, it was probably more unpopular than it was popular. People felt like, It had gone too far, even if they had agreed with abolishing the monarchy or constraining the powers of the monarch to execute him. That was too far for a lot of people.
But the Black Legion disbanded after the Ministry of War accused St. George of using government funds to buy horses and sell them for a profit. So Alex Dumas traversed the fronts in leadership posts for the French armies of the North and West Pyrenees. Amidst the frenzy, Dumas found just 4 days to spend with his newborn daughter, Marie, before riding out again. Civil war ate at France from the inside, and the mighty armies of Europe, Spain, Portugal, Naples, Austria, and Great Britain, harassed its borders.
Oh yeah, at this point, it really must have felt like the revolution was falling apart. Now, I think in retrospect, we can obviously see that the revolution would continue, or at least the revolutionary governments would continue, and that some of the threats may have been a little over-exaggerated, but at the time, you feel you're being attacked on all sides by foreign enemies and internal enemies. I mean, there are revolts going on throughout France. At this point, very widespread in many different cities and areas, some quite serious. If you're an ardent revolutionary, you might feel like it really is coming to an end, and something must be done to reverse this, go back to the revolution.
The French National Convention
and this is what is done.
Formed the Committee of Public Safety, 9 powerful deputies to root out both the foreign and domestic enemies of the revolution at all costs. These leaders of France performed an ongoing self-lobotomy in the name of liberty, an undaunting quest to destroy the persons and symbols of impure tradition. The sleeping kings of old were torn from their tombs, their bones scattered in mass graves. The church and its shattered monuments were usurped by the cult of the supreme being, and time itself was bent to deify the revolution.
Yes. And of course, this was the revolution at its most radical. We can see things like the new revolutionary calendar, the true marginalization of the Catholic Church in favor of the cult of reason, the cult of the supreme being, but obviously, most of all, the trials and executions of many, many people, a lot of them for very shaky reasons or no reason at all. This is the reign of terror, when many people were executed by the Committee of Public Safety in an effort to sort of revitalize the revolution and protect France from all of these different threats. That's what I was pointing out earlier. You can see how the whole revolution was falling apart, and of course, this is sort of a horrible tragedy, but sort of from that mindset, you might be able to start understanding why at least some people turned in this direction, further radicalism, in order to, as they viewed it, save the revolution.
And every day the blade fell on the necks of seditious men and women. Their heads held aloft as the prized fruit of the revolution. Proof of their sedition mattered little. As one deputy declared, "You must punish not only the traitors, but the apathetic as well. You must punish whoever is passive in the Republic." The Committee of Public Safety frequently executed unsuccessful French generals in front of their own troops.
Oh yeah, at this point, being a French general was an extremely dangerous job. You did not want to be a French general, because if you made a mistake, or you were too passive, or you didn't take the action that the government wanted, whether or not that was the best course of action, you risked being called back to Paris and executed. And so we see a couple of generals at this point flee the country, flee their command, and go over to the enemies of the Republic because they're afraid of being executed for making, one mistake or another.
And in the bitter winter of 1793, the committee delivered Dumas an impossible task.
And that's what they liked to do, deliver their generals impossible tasks, and then if you failed this impossible task, you'd be called back to Paris and executed. Or not always executed, you might be imprisoned or removed from your position or punished in some other way, but the risk of being killed was quite high.
Dumas took command of 50,000 men stationed around the glacial terrain of Mont-Cenis.
Wow, that's
As general of
pretty big force. I didn't know he was in charge of that many individuals.
the Army of the Alps, he was to drive out the Austrians and Piedmontese and clear the way to spread the revolution eastward. But sinking dunes of snow still blocked the mountain passes, and Dumas bluntly refused to make the assault under current conditions. The Committee of Public Safety made known its dissatisfaction at his delay.
Fighting back the Austrians and the Piedmontese in that area, who do we know who's going to successfully do that? Maybe a little someone named Napoleon?
The National Convention wants its generals to obey
later.
the orders of the committee. You will answer with your head for their implementation.
Uh-oh.
The guillotine casts a shadow on his every move. Still, Alex Dumas maintained faith in the nobler principles of the revolution. France finally abolished slavery, and Dumas addressed his troops.
Yep.
I was born in a climate.
And, I mean, that's a whole other thing that we could go into. Maybe we have some videos on the Haitian Revolution, the abolishment of slavery, how that was done on the island of Haiti, or, sorry, in the colony of Haiti. The entire island isn't just Haiti. The continued conflict. Just keep in mind, there was a lot going on in Haiti at the same time as there's a lot going on back in France. The French Revolution, we often talk about it from a French context, but the effects of the French Revolution are truly global. We can look in many places throughout the world to see the broader effects.
And among men for whom liberty also had charms, and who fought for it first. Sincere lover of liberty and equality, I will be proud to march out before you. And the coalition of tyrants will learn that they are loathed equally by men of all colors. After months of fateful negotiation, Dumas made his assault. A detachment of French troops faced the long and treacherous pass up the mountain, beset by violent winds and enemy spies.
Tough. Yeah, I'm curious to see how this goes. I don't know that much about Dumas' career in particular. This expedition, this is one amongst many throughout the French Revolutionary Wars and then, sort of the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, we know a lot more about Napoleon's career in particular, but something like this I really don't know that much about.
They shuffled along ice cliffs that dangled over black chasms. Then, the crack of enemy artillery split the French line. Soldiers tumbled into the abyss, others bled out in snowbanks. As night approached, survivors scaled their way back down the mountain. General Dumas would not abandon the mission so easily. In the coming weeks, his troops captured a key pass and an enemy fort. The enemy still held the summit. French troops, cloaked in white camouflage with iron crampons fixed to their boots, followed closely as General Dumas scaled cliffs of ice. Upon finding the enemy encampments, they raised their bayonets and charged. Dumas took the mountain and 1,000 prisoners. He became a national hero, but soon the Committee of Public Safety ordered him to Paris. No reason was given. Perhaps his presence at the Champ de Mars massacre had raised suspicions. At any rate, a sham trial.
I mean, it didn't take much to raise suspicion at this point. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you were in trouble. But the Champ de Mars massacre, this was a real big moment in the whole revolution, a bit of a turning point. And so if you were associated with a notorious event like that, you might find yourself in trouble.
And execution almost assuredly awaited him. He delayed his return, and by the time he arrived in Paris,
Smart.
the committee was collapsing in on itself.
Very
Most
smart.
fanatical deputies were themselves executed.
Yeah, a good decision to delay your return. Dumas, you may have just missed your own execution.
France effectively abandoned the committee and much of its violent radicalism.
Yes, well, Robespierre had become the leader of the Committee of Public Safety. He was its most radical member. He was intent on purging France and introducing what he viewed as virtue, Republican virtue. He was truly radical, and by the end, it seems like he was kind of going a little out of his mind. He might have been losing it a little bit. It's sort of hard to tell, but, he kind of gone off the deep end. And so, in his fanatical quest, he started threatening those around him, legislators, other members of the Committee of Public Safety, and that was the thing. Once he turned it inwards, he started threatening them, then that was too far. And the powers that be turned on Robespierre, executed him, and this whole thing, sort of came to an end, and we move on to the next phase of the revolution.
Nowhere had their so-called reign of terror been more pronounced than at General Dumas' next posting. The pious French region of Vendée had resisted the revolution. The abolition of their...
Not a good posting to have, the Vendée, a region in France, a rural region that is, or was at this time, it was very Catholic, very royalist, a lot of traditional French peasants, and the nobility that led them. It strongly resisted the French Revolution, it resisted the revolutionary governments, and that resistance, though it continued for a while, was stamped out extremely brutally. The revolutionary governments treated the Vendée and the people of the Vendée with extreme violence and brutality. So, not a great posting to have.
Their church enforced conscription. Amidst civil war, French national soldiers aimed to exterminate the region's inhabitants.
Yeah.
To conserve...
And in this case, and in a lot of cases, the main issue was truly religion. Now, of course, the people of this region were inflamed by many things. The execution of the king, the conscriptions, the revolutionary government wanted to conscript men to fight in its wars, all of this stuff. But in the Vendée, and in a lot of regions, in France and throughout Europe, the main issue a lot of people would come to have with the French Revolution was the religion part. How secular and at times anti-Catholic the revolutionaries were versus how pious a lot of these peasants and nobles were. A lot of these people were real believing Catholics. And so the revolutionaries being secular, or like I said, anti-Catholic, was about the worst thing you could be.
Ammunition, soldiers had organized mass drownings of civilians. Priests, nuns, women, and children included. Dumas took control of this army of the West and saw firsthand the victims of its barbarity. Dumas refused to conceal the dark reality perpetrated on behalf of the revolution. He reported that the hellscape was not merely the result of improper training. The evil lies deeper in the spirit of indiscipline and pillage that rules throughout the army, a spirit produced by habit and nourished by impunity. General Dumas significantly reduced war crimes when he replaced officers and mandated training in soldiers' ethics.
Really?
He quietly
significantly reduced war crimes. Now, I don't know about his time in the Vendée. That could still include him committing war crimes. I don't know. The way they're presenting it, it seems like he improved the situation. But, with such a brutal and sort of sensitive topic, I couldn't tell you unless I looked more into it.
Returned home to recover and accepted a new post along the Rhine. In a year, his wife gave birth to a second daughter named Louise. He cherished his family time and then ventured east to join the French army of Italy under its 27-year-old commander-in-chief.
Once again, it's all about your posting. Where are you? Are you in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time? If we look at the army of Italy under Napoleon, a lot of those people who worked with Napoleon, a lot of his subordinates who had performed well, would go on to serve very high positions throughout Napoleon's career. Now, of course, there were people Napoleon worked with and came to trust that weren't involved in the army of Italy. Of course, also some of them who had already known Napoleon and he took them along with him. But the point is, if you were serving under Napoleon at this time, that was a great opportunity. And of course, at that time, you wouldn't have known how much of a great opportunity it was. But What we can see is that, oh, you're serving under Napoleon during his Italian campaigns? Good place to be.
Napoleon Bonaparte controlled battlefields with magnetic decisiveness, imbued each victory with a rousing sense of destiny. He had conquered Milan and rebuilt its society on more egalitarian revolutionary principles.
Yeah.
Unlike the throngs of Napoleon's acolytes among the French ranks, Alex Dumas felt little admiration for the man. To supplement supplies, Napoleon encouraged his soldiers to loot the very towns they claimed to liberate. They robbed impoverished locals and gutted Milan of its precious artifacts.
Yeah, I was going to say, Napoleon's treatment of the Italians is perhaps at best a mixed bag. There was a lot of pillaging, especially pillaging of fine art. The French did a lot of that, not just here, but beyond this point, certainly. There were atrocities committed, towns pillaged, burned, massacred. But I think you could also make the point that Napoleon wasn't, I would say, arbitrarily cruel. He committed these acts of violence when he felt he had to. Now, look, that's not much of a defense. And he knew that he was committing brutality at times. But the other side of it is, as they mentioned, he did try to impart Republican, egalitarian ideals on these places, Milan in particular. Now, these were very controversial. There were some Italians, some of the Milanese, who agreed with these ideas and very much supported them. There were some people who, whether they were religious or royalists or conservatives, strongly opposed these policies. And there were a lot of people who maybe they agreed, maybe they disagreed, maybe they were in the middle, but of course they were incredibly suspicious of these French conquerors. Now, of course, before this time, this region of Italy had been dominated by the Austrians. So you were going from foreign conqueror to foreign conqueror. So it's not like it was great before, but that still doesn't mean that people in the region necessarily loved the French or loved Napoleon. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. There is some good, perhaps, you could see it that way, but there's also a significant amount of bad.
As the French took northern Italy, Dumas publicly clashed with his commander-in-chief.
Uh-oh.
He noted that pillaging often invited the abuse and murder of civilians. He also took offense to Napoleon's right-hand man downplaying his exploits in battle. General Bonaparte finally demoted Dumas, had him tucked away in some cavalry division on the front lines. Dumas then...
Yeah, well... As I pointed out, serving under Napoleon, a good way to move up. But if you don't like Napoleon and you publicly clash with him, yeah, that's probably going to negate the positive consequences of serving under him.
Received a grave letter from his wife. He answered back, "To the only one I care about in the whole world, my virtuous friend, you have told me about an event that tears away half of my existence. I am still trembling." His 13-month-old daughter, Louise, was dead.
Damn.
When the soldier's tears dried, he rode out again into the looming Alps. With a lethal sword and trusted musket, he indulged in the anesthesia of battle. The Austrians began to dread the man who hunted them so relentlessly. They called him the Black Devil. To drive the Austrians out of Italy, the French needed to take a bridge which hung over a flowing river by the village of Clausen. Austrians rained down fire on Dumas and his dragoons as they passed through. Dumas spurred his steed and charged the bridge with his aide-de-camp, Dermancourt. Across the bridge, the two found themselves cut off, ambushed. Dermancourt was struck in the shoulder. Austrian snipers fired on the charging Dumas. Bullets met flesh, and he tumbled into the dirt. An enemy called out, "The Black Devil is dead." In the still of battle,
that can't be true.
A weary arm rose from behind the fallen horse. Dumas returned fire. The Austrians stormed forward. With saber in hand, Dumas blocked.
I mean, clearly a brave and daring commander. Look, he may have gotten into a bit of a spat with Napoleon, but we know Dumas is going to be prominent again in the future, and he's clearly distinguishing himself here.
The bridge. He swung with masterful ferocity, pierced and cleaved his challengers, and cast several into the river below.
Wow.
His attackers slashed open his head and thigh, but he refused to fall. At last, French reinforcements sent the Austrians fleeing.
Wow, how about that?
Blood ran from his wounds. Dumas...
I mean, that's a real warrior. You know what I mean? Not only is he a good leader, a leader of men, but he individually, he's a fighter, he's a warrior. I guess, some of that fencing training from earlier in his life, worked a charm, because, look at him go.
Mounted a horse and chased the enemy into the woods for hours. He and his men took 1,500 prisoners that day.
Ooh, nice.
When Napoleon learned of the bridge battle, he hailed Dumas as a hero and promoted him.
There you go.
Napoleon pressed on to cripple Austria and forced them into a peace treaty.
Now look, Napoleon, he could be difficult to get along with, and he could at times hold grudges, but I would say in general, and there are examples going either way, but in general, Napoleon was good at recognizing excellence and talent in the people around him. And he was generally pretty good at promoting those people. Like I said, there are, of course, examples that you can look at where Napoleon missed out on someone, or, he thought someone was great and they weren't. Absolutely. But I'd say in general, Napoleon was good at recognizing that talent and, promoting it. Which, if you're a good leader, that's an important skill to have.
That ceded vast swaths of land to the Republic. Dumas would return home to his grieving wife and daughter. In 1798, he arrived on the docks of the southern French coast. Napoleon had assembled an invasion force, its mission so swaddled in secrecy that the 50,000 men aboard its warships were themselves ignorant of their destination.
Yep.
Napoleon at last addressed them. "Soldiers, the eyes of Europe are upon you. You have a grand destiny to fulfill, battles to fight, dangers and trials to overcome. The genius of liberty that has made the Republic, since its birth, the arbiter of Europe, desires that it also be the arbiter of the seas and of the farthest lands." The fleet waded into the Mediterranean, just past the gaze of lurking British warships.
Oh yeah. Throughout their time in the Mediterranean, the French had to be careful to avoid the British, and they couldn't avoid them forever, and when the British got a shot at them, that was bad for the French. But it was dangerous for them to be out there in the Mediterranean because, the British Navy wasn't at the fullest extent of its power that it would reach, but it was extremely formidable, and the British were already becoming the masters of the seas, as the French at the same time were becoming the masters of the land, right? I think the Egyptian expedition is a real interesting time in Napoleon's career. And I say that more because it's sort of undercovered. We don't really talk about it that much. I think because, it was sort of this odd, I don't want to say sideshow. I feel that minimizes it. But, it's a bit away from the rest of his campaigns. The consequences of the entire campaign don't seem to be too great. It was perhaps less influential than a lot of the other things Napoleon did. And so we're sort of left looking at it like, what was the point of that? But, I would still very much like to see more content on Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. It's a real interesting time, and there were reasons he went. Now, maybe it wasn't the best idea. You could certainly argue that, and it didn't end up super fantastically. That's probably one of the other reasons we don't cover it that much, because it was not one of Napoleon's finest hours. It was not one of his most impressive campaigns. A lot of things didn't go well for him. But we're going to be talking about it a bit here because, of course, Dumas was involved, as we're seeing.
Napoleon had meant what he said. He believed fate now presided over this mission. As a boy, he had pored over the pages of history and desired to join the pantheon of great conquerors. He wrote, "I dreamed of many things, and I saw how I could realize all my dreams."
Yeah, I mean, I will say, though, at this point, personally for Napoleon, because, we're following Dumas and also sort of a broader narrative of the French Revolution, and then, Napoleon vaguely, but we're not really following Napoleon specifically. At this point, we've had Napoleon's campaign in Italy. He's had a lot of success. His power, military power, and political power is growing. This is when he's really seeing the opportunities laid out in front of him, and he's really developing these grand ambitions. Now, Napoleon, throughout his entire life, has always had pretty grand ambitions. He's been an ambitious fella from the start. But this is when a lot of them start seeming more real to him. He starts thinking of himself alongside those great conquerors of old, and he begins thinking, what can he achieve in the future? Because he's already seen a lot of success in Italy, a lot of military success. He's been building his image, building his political power, and now he organizes this Egyptian campaign. Napoleon, you could say maybe he's a little overconfident. Napoleon's thinking, what should I do next? I can get anything done? Where should I go? So this is definitely an interesting point in Napoleon's career. Chapter 3. The Farthest Lands.
On a starless, gusty night, French longboats careened over violent seas. Dozens of sailors fell overboard, disappeared into black waves. At last, they reached the shores of Alexandria. The people of Egypt had for half a millennia languished under the iron rule of their former European slaves, the Mamluks. Napoleon fashioned himself their liberator.
Yes, he did. Napoleon fashioned himself a liberator wherever he went. The people of Egypt, ruled over by the Mamelukes, a rather sort of chaotic and bloody reign. They're often fighting amongst each other for power. Napoleon shows up and he tries to portray himself as the savior of the people of Egypt. He's going to kick out the Mamelukes. He's going to liberate them. He presents himself as someone who understands and respects their culture, respects Islam. Napoleon did a lot of outreach to the Islamic community throughout this time, and it seems that at some points he may have even considered converting to Islam in order to further bolster his reputation. Now, Napoleon was not much of a spiritual man, especially not at this point. He was a sort of radical Republican. He wasn't that into religion. In fact, he could be pretty dismissive of religion at times. So, some people get the wrong idea that Napoleon was a true believer in the faith of Islam. That was most certainly not the case, but he did make an effort to sort of read up, show respect, and like I said, at one point, it seemed like he may even consider converting in order to bolster his legitimacy. But, the rest of his men weren't really into that. Many of them were secular. Many of them were Catholics, some pretty devoted Catholics. So you can see where the conflict sort of comes into play there. Also, if Napoleon had converted to Islam, that would have certainly been an impediment to his progress back in Europe. So, in the end, he didn't. But he did try and portray himself as a friend to Islam.
Napoleon had selected Dumas to lead the army's cavalry, but for now, General Dumas marched on foot with the others. Horses and artillery would be brought ashore when the seas calmed. The Mamluk rulers panicked upon seeing the invasion force. With rifle in hand, Dumas led a contingent of troops over the walls. Within a day, the city fell under French control.
Yeah, well, the Mamelukes were just absolutely not ready for what Napoleon was bringing. And, fair enough. Like they said, it was kind of a shocker that Napoleon would even go in this direction. The Mamelukes had, they just weren't ready to face a modern French Republican army of this size, this discipline. They just had no chance, basically.
The golden age of Alexandria had long since passed. Its derelict cityscape failed to meet the French demand for horses and supplies.
Yeah.
Napoleon nonetheless endeavored to press on and strike the true heart of Mamluk power. The long walk to Cairo began with a 3-day march to Damanhur, across a burning desert. Clothed in wool with limited water, the infantry marched first. One officer recalled, "After an hour's march, the soldier is overcome by the heat and the weight he carries. He unburdens himself, throwing down his rations, focusing only on the present, with no thought of tomorrow. When thirst comes, he finds no water. That is why, in the horrors of this scene, you saw soldiers die of thirst, of starvation, of heat, while their comrades, on seeing this suffering, blew out their own brains."
Yeah. I mean, pretty terrible conditions for these French soldiers. And you can already see, while, it wasn't like the Egyptian campaign was a total military failure for Napoleon. Now, there was that naval loss to the Brits, but, in terms of the on-land military operations, it wasn't terrible, but you can see how much the men were struggling, how sort of pointless it ended up being, the bad conditions. It was this campaign that Napoleon started with these grand ambitions, and it just sort of petered off, is what I would say, which is why it's certainly not seen as a great achievement of Napoleon's. Probably more a failure than anything, but actually, more than anything, forgettable in many ways, or at least something that doesn't stand out in terms of its importance compared to many of the other achievements and things Napoleon did.
Bedouin raiders stalked these dunes, dragged away French stragglers who dared lag behind. General Dumas rode out to pay their ransom, whereupon Napoleon learned that any prisoners who hadn't been decapitated had been violated. Dumas and Napoleon trekked across the desert on horseback and met the weary infantry in Damanhur. The way to Cairo was 100 miles more, and most of the cavalry still lacked horses. In full view of his troops, Dumas cast down his hat and stomped it. He shouted that the French government had deported them all on an aimless suicide mission because they feared the rise of Napoleon.
And, I mean, that's not really true. Napoleon was as enthused about this campaign as anybody else. It just wasn't going well. But you can begin to see why the men were getting pretty damn frustrated. These terrible conditions. A lot of them are dying from hunger, from thirst, or, like that guy before said, blowing out their own brains for what they saw as no reason, We're not losing any great military defeats. We're the same strong Republican army. We always have been, but we're dropping dead in the desert. Why are we even here? They feel like they've been cast out. They've been left behind by the French government, basically. And so this frustration is growing. People are saying, why are we here? Eventually someone might say, maybe we shouldn't be here. Can we do that?
Napoleon had, in fact, orchestrated the expedition himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Alex Dumas' concerns about the mission's practicality had struck a chord.
Yep.
In the dead hours of the night, several generals gathered in his tent.
And this is what happens when people start to say, maybe we shouldn't be here. Can we leave? Let's do something about that.
In hushed voices, the men decried the absurdity of taking a desert in July. They considered confronting Napoleon and refusing to carry on past Cairo. The march to Cairo brought new afflictions. Dysentery eviscerated the troops, and trachoma left thousands blind. On July 21st, after a 13-hour march, the battle for Egypt appeared before them. Across the sands stood 10,000 Mamluks, drawn up on horseback with glistening swords. Napoleon rallied his troops and gestured towards the ancient horizon. Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you.
And you can sort of understand Napoleon's grand ambitions given his experience, and also keeping in mind that Napoleon is always looking back on those conquerors of old. That's who he's viewing himself alongside. He's thinking of these great ancient conquerors who had gone to Egypt, with the background of the pyramids. It's all rather grand, and Napoleon was a rather grand fellow. He certainly thought in those terms, though you can sort of see how sometimes his ambition might overshadow reality, right?
Napoleon pulled his troops into infantry squares. The French fired at the Mamluk stampede from all directions. Within a few hours, Napoleon stood victorious on a smoldering battlefield. Generals Dumas and Joachim Murat chased the last remnants of Mamluk rule into the desert.
Now, once again, we have an actual military engagement, and the French win it. But they're still marching through the desert, dropping dead from thirst, or at least they have been. So, while I'm sure this victory was encouraging to a lot of the soldiers, you can kind of see why people are frustrated. We win every land battle we get into, and yet we're still in these terrible conditions. At least now we've reached the city. Let's not go any further.
French scholars were free to scour pharaonic monuments and tombs and study the long-forgotten script that covered...
Yeah, well, this honestly might be the greatest legacy of the Egyptian campaign.
...ancient relics. Napoleon conferred on Cairo the benefits of a modern French republic. Egalitarian laws were accompanied by hospitals, sanitation measures, and bakeries. At the same time, Napoleon made no effort to infringe on the lucrative slave trade that had flourished under the Mamluks. He was troubled by
Well, as we will see throughout his career, Napoleon seems to have been more anti-slavery. When he was younger, more of a radical revolutionary. But, first off, Napoleon was, I think, above all else, a practical fellow. Now, sometimes his ambition could overshadow that, but if we're talking about ideology, Napoleon certainly did have some strongly held beliefs, but Napoleon was more into doing whatever would achieve his goals. And as he got older, further into his career, he became, more of a centrist figure. His opinions on slavery would change. Or if maybe it's less of an opinion thing, but his actions on slavery would change. And we may or may not see that in this video. I'm not entirely sure.
Another matter, one that he now decided to confront. Napoleon stormed into the quarters of his cavalry commander and stared up at Alex Dumas. "You have preached sedition. Beware that I don't fulfill my duty, for your 6 feet and 1 inch would not prevent you from being shot in 2 hours." Dumas requested that he be allowed to return to France, and Napoleon gave his consent.
Yeah. So this is probably one of the more well-known moments of Dumas' career. This situation where Napoleon confronts him for preaching sedition doesn't... the Egyptian campaign, of course, doesn't end well for Dumas. It's sort of an ignoble way to go for someone so talented. Now, there are questions about, to what extent was this meeting between the officers actually sedition? Were they planning sedition? Were they planning some sort of mutiny? Or were they just commiserating over the terrible situation, right? Were they just getting together and saying, man, this sucks. We're stuck out in the desert. This is terrible. Was it that? Or was it, we have to do something, Let's raise a mutiny. Let's overthrow Napoleon. Obviously, it was probably something in between the two, but I'm not entirely sure. And, I kind of think you can't blame them for being frustrated in these conditions. But, Napoleon specifically singles out Dumas. And so, this is how the Egyptian campaign sort of ends for Dumas in particular. And, the Egyptian campaign, it's not like it ends super well for Napoleon and the rest of them. Like I said, sort of peters out by the end. And, Napoleon returns back to France, leaving a lot of his men in Egypt. All right, chapter 4, Trapped.
The night sky over Alexandria awoke with fire. The British had attacked the stationary French armada and exploded the ammunition stocked in Napoleon's ship, Orient. The men aboard were incinerated. The decimation of the...
And this is why I say, I was very clear to point out that, the land battles the French didn't have too much trouble with. This is, of course, a battle at sea, and this is the exception. Overall, this was not a total military failure for Napoleon, this whole campaign. I mean, he beat the Mamelukes, but this battle with the British Navy, this is pretty terrible. This is a big loss for the French.
The French fleet effectively left Dumas and the other troops stranded in North Africa, with a population that began to resent French rule.
Yeah.
Napoleon had proclaimed himself an emissary of Mohammed, and the Egyptians greeted his claims with derision and his secular reforms with reluctance.
Well, this is the thing. I was talking earlier about how Napoleon presented himself as a friend of Islam, but he refused to convert. He may have thought about it, but he refused. He implemented these liberal, secular laws. So his claim to be a friend of Islam and an emissary of Muhammad, most people didn't believe this. They viewed it very skeptically. Of course, not to mention that Napoleon was this foreign conqueror. Now, the Mamelukes certainly weren't liked, and this was Napoleon's strategy. He knew that the Mamelukes weren't popular, and he wanted to come in and say, I'll do a better job than them. But it's not always that easy. And so, a lot of the people of Egypt, instead of seeing him as some sort of liberator, they were quite suspicious and viewed him with a certain degree of hostility. And then we reached this terrible naval battle with the Brits, which basically leaves a lot of the French trapped in Egypt, which is a pretty terrible position to be in. I mean, first off, it enforces British domination over the Mediterranean. And now, the French are in some ways cut off from supplies, cut off from France. Communication is challenged. These things aren't completely cut off, but it's certainly not a good place to be. And, this is where a lot of the negative aspects come in to the expedition to Egypt. Without this great British naval victory and all of that, this would be more a victory for the French, but maybe one that was pointless and forgettable. This is what makes it a real mixed bag for Napoleon and France overall.
Religious leaders now decried the French as infidels and ordered the death of all Frenchmen. Cairo erupted. In the bloody conflict, Dumas took a rebel headquarters and helped subdue the revolt. In early 1799, Alex Dumas hired a Maltese sailor for transport back to France, along with a few dozen wounded French soldiers. He provided extra funds to make repairs to the vessel. General Dumas climbed aboard with grinding bones and weary muscles. He longed to return to Marie-Louise and his daughter. As the vessel drifted north, the deck trembled and groaned. The hull dipped deeper into the sea. Water flooded in. The Maltese sailor had apparently pocketed the repair money Dumas had given him. Dumas ordered cannons and horses thrown overboard to lighten the burden. An ocean storm thrashed their unsound vessel about. The crew elected to turn into the nearest Allied port, the Italian city of Taranto. Leery officials met them on the docks, placed them in custody. Without explanation, they moved Dumas to a stone cell. Days passed.
Damn.
Weeks.
When they said they were making it to an Italian city, I thought, maybe they might be safe. They made it a little further than I thought, but they've been imprisoned, so not the worst case scenario. I mean, the worst case scenario was drowning at sea or, landing on extremely hostile territory. You get shot as soon as you arrive, but this is obviously not a great position to be in.
Barred window afforded him an ever-present view of his armed captors, and let in the rain and coastal winds, which dampened the straw on the stone bench he used for a bed. Each day the jailers came by to deliver a few biscuits, and each day Dumas begged them to speak with the governor and resolve whatever misunderstanding had provoked his imprisonment.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this situation at all, so I'm not even sure under what authority he's been imprisoned or who controls this city, though they said it was an Allied port. So I'm curious to see, why exactly this has occurred.
The guards mocked him. Taranto had, in fact, fallen into enemy hands. A counter-revolutionary movement called the Holy Faith Army. In their attempts to restore the local king, the army massacred those they suspected of dissent, liberals
there you go.
and Jews.
Ooh.
Dumas used his outdoor time to pace in the sun and to think, until one day the guards came to bolt his cell door shut.
Jeez.
The dark...
Yeah, pretty terrible situation to be in. You're trapped in a counter-revolutionary city, though as a fairly prominent revolutionary soldier, maybe you can get some sort of prisoner trade. That's if anybody knows where to find you, of course. Dumas set out with some injured men. They got lost at sea. Not quite lost, but caught in a bad situation, so probably no one knows where Dumas is. Though, like I said, a prisoner as valuable as him, maybe a prisoner trade could be worked out.
Months seemed to bleed together in squalid isolation. Dumas lost sight in one eye, hearing in one ear, and half of his face became paralyzed.
Jesus.
The release of death felt close. He wrote often to Marie-Louise, divulging paranoid suspicions that his captors were poisoning him. His jailers apparently never sent his letters. So the world passed into the 19th century, and French wars raged on without Dumas.
Wow.
Upon invading Italy, General Murat scattered enemies and secured the release of all French prisoners of war.
Jeez.
In March of 1801, Alex Dumas limped out of prison, 39 years old and broken.
Yeah, that is a tough stint. Real difficult conditions to be in, and I'm kind of surprised. I thought maybe the French government would have been able to secure his release a little bit earlier, but, well, I don't know what the situation was, right? Maybe they didn't try, maybe they didn't know, maybe they couldn't. I have no idea, but yeah, that's a tough position to be in.
In Paris, Dumas reunited with Marie-Louise in belated embrace. The revolutionary France for which Dumas had fought died while he was behind bars when Napoleon returned from his desert campaign and staged a coup. For all the stability this new state offered, its veneer of democracy took the feeble forms of contrived rhetoric and useless legislative bodies.
Yep.
Napoleon Bonaparte was its de facto dictator.
Yep, de facto, and then just straight up dictator, emperor. At this point, he's still first consul. Like they said, some veneer of democracy. Napoleon he always loved to talk about the Republic, even though basically the Republic was no more. Napoleon's a real interesting character because, in some ways, he completely betrays the revolution. As a young man, Napoleon is, like I said, a fairly radical revolutionary. He seems to be a true believer. But, of course, he throws this coup. Well, he joins in on the coup of Abbé Sieyès, and then he hijacks it and makes it his coup, and then he crowns himself emperor. So that is a complete betrayal of the revolution. But in some other ways, Napoleon does hold on to some of those revolutionary and liberal ideas, which he will implement during his tenure as ruler of France. So in some ways, Napoleon ends the revolution. Absolutely. In other ways, though, he continues the legacy of the revolution, implementing revolutionary policy, not just in France, but throughout Europe. Very sort of interesting contradiction. You can certainly have different opinions on it. I think it's a fascinating thing to look at. Of course, you could look at something like the example of Haiti in particular. Slavery had been abolished. There was an attempt to promote racial equality within Haiti, and then Napoleon, not quite yet, but he will go back on all of that and try to, reconquer Haiti again for the French and reestablish white power in the colony. So, real interesting back and forth. There's been a lot of writing and a lot of opinions on Napoleon's relationship to the revolution and the revolutionary ideals. So, hey, I mean, leave your opinions down below if you want to. It's a interesting question/topic.
At home, Dumas doted on his young daughter and regained his health. His family was suffering. His years in prison had gone unpaid, despite the promises of the French military. He wrote to Napoleon,
I'm kind of surprised. I mean, I suppose it's because his relationship with Napoleon was not good. Maybe that's why Dumas seems to have been left behind by the French government and the French military, despite his relatively prominent position. I guess it would be because he had a spat with Napoleon early on in his career, but then, of course, the accusation of sedition. Maybe that's why Dumas wasn't getting the treatment that he deserved.
I hope that you will not allow the man who shared your work and your dangers to languish like a beggar. The letters went unanswered.
Wow.
As Dumas had come to expect, the ideals publicly espoused by Napoleon were frequently tools for personal and political expediency. Napoleon admitted as much. I finished the war in Vendée by making myself a Catholic. I established myself in Egypt by converting to Islam. I won minds in Italy by becoming a reactionary. If I governed the Jews, I would rebuild the Temple of Solomon.
Yep, and I mean, this is a great summary of Napoleon from Napoleon himself. Of course, when he says he converted to Islam, he didn't actually convert. He specifically refused to convert. But, he means by embracing Islam in many ways. And this is true. Napoleon's an interesting fellow. Like I said, he did have some revolutionary and liberal ideas that he held onto and he believed in, and he would continually implement them. But Napoleon was also an opportunist. And so whatever ideology or whatever image he could embrace to make himself appealing in a particular situation, that's exactly what he would do. And he's laying it out well here, whether he needed to appeal to Catholics or appeal to Muslims or appeal to conservatives, or he gives another example that didn't actually happen, but that's exactly what he's saying. He's willing to do what it takes to appeal to the people he needs to appeal to. And, I mean, that's what he did as first consul and then as emperor. He wanted to appeal very broadly to the French public, and so he starts to move more towards the center, while attempting not to alienate the left and the right. Though, of course, he has to do that to a certain extent because, the right-wingers, many of them are still not very fond of him, and as he moves towards the center, some of the left-wingers feel that he's betrayed them in some ways, but this is what he wants to do. He wants to have this broad general appeal, and a big part of that is just him trying to build his own power base, though it does seem like he did become more conservative as the years went on, just genuinely in terms of his own personal opinions. He certainly was not the radical revolutionary that he had once been. So, a great quote from the man himself.
Though he preached egalitarianism, Napoleon's rise had been supported by the formerly slave-owning planter class. He now ordered the recapture of Saint-Domingue and the extermination of its ongoing slave uprising.
Yep, this is exactly what I was talking about. Napoleon was, all buddy-buddy with the white planters of France's colonies, Saint-Domingue in particular. It was so profitable. And so that's exactly what he did. He ordered the recapture of the island for France, the destruction of any black political power, and the reestablishment of white supremacy on the island. So once again, we have a situation where, Napoleon, supposedly egalitarian, either, his beliefs shifted over time, and, this was a genuine belief of his, or he decided that this was the best, most practical route to take, and he did it. And there's a lot of very unflattering quotes that you can find from Napoleon in regards to Haiti and the black population of the island.
Napoleon took an erratic approach to slavery. He guarded abolition wherever popular, but may have planned to reinstitute slavery in Saint-Domingue, and maintained it in regions that had fallen out of French hands at the time.
I think this is a good way to phrase it, sort of an erratic approach to slavery. Like I said, I think he did become more conservative as he aged, but it was also a situation of, if he thought abolishing slavery would be beneficial, he would do that. And by beneficial, I mean beneficial to him. And if he thought that maintaining it or reestablishing it would be beneficial, then that's the direction he would go in.
Of the 1790s.
Of course, he never actually regained control of Haiti. The resistance of the formerly enslaved Haitians themselves made sure of that.
94 abolition decree. To consolidate these moves, Napoleon reasserted French white identity. He banned all former officers and soldiers of color from living in or around Paris.
Wow.
Dumas was obligated to apply for special authorization to continue living in his own home. Napoleon's government closed French borders to people of color and blocked mixed marriages. Dumas longed to return to the battlefield, but a military with segregated infirmaries offered no opportunities for a person of color to command largely white troops.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing to see. I talked about much earlier in this reaction about that racial hierarchy in France and, say, in the United States by comparison. It's interesting to see how these things change and develop over time. The French Revolution occurs, and a lot of the radical French revolutionaries, a lot of the Jacobins, say, were abolitionists, were anti-slavery. And so there represented, I think, a real opportunity in the French Revolution to abolish slavery in the French colonies. And slavery was abolished, and there were revolts, in Haiti in particular, where a lot of the people of color, a lot of the enslaved people, in some way or another inspired by the promise of the French Revolution, had risen up to free themselves. But, the Jacobin power is broken, the Committee of Public Safety eventually ends, the French Revolution sort of moderates to a certain extent, and especially when we get to Napoleon, and a lot of the promise of the revolution that once existed sort of comes to an end, and that is also true in the case of slavery and racial hierarchy. A lot of this racial hierarchy is not only reestablished, but established perhaps even worse than before. I'm not entirely sure, but we see the shift in a particular direction under Napoleon. So it's a real interesting process, I think. Not to mention that during the Haitian Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution was very complicated. We have, of course, the enslaved people rising up against the planters, and then, fighting against the French government, and then, with the abolition of slavery, we have the French government coming together with the people of Haiti, and then we have conflict again, real complicated conflict with many powers involved, the white planters, the mixed race community, the French government, the Brits were involved, the Spanish, super complicated, but we have a lot of violence and brutality on that island, and to a lot of these, white French people back in France, they look at that violence and it really disturbs them. And, a lot of them interpret this, and what they take from this is very negative opinions about the black Haitians, right? And so for a lot of them, they sort of internalize these racist attitudes that they may have already held or they may have picked up. And so we perhaps sort of see a shift in the wrong direction. Though, like I said, France doesn't regain control of Haiti. It continues to fight and resist French domination.
Napoleon ignored Dumas' offers to fight. Dumas' family was intact for now. He welcomed a son, Alexander, into the world in the summer of 1802. In the birthplace
Alexandre Dumas, who would go on to be very famous in his own right. The Count of Monte Cristo. He was the author of that and other famous plays and novels. He's probably more famous than his father, frankly. Though, to French Revolution and Napoleon fans like myself, we may have more interest in Thomas-Alexandre. But his son, very important, influential fellow.
Place of General Dumas, Saint-Domingue, former slaves made headway in their struggle. In 1804, they at last drove out the French and established the independent nation of Haiti.
Yep.
The loss did not prevent Napoleon from crowning himself Emperor of France that year, as he fended off the combined armies of Europe. Around this time, a heaviness gripped Dumas, an implacable exhaustion, agony in his abdomen. His toddler Alexander accompanied him to the doctor in Paris, and later recalled a meeting between his father and General Mirha to discuss the care of the Dumas family in the near future.
Wow.
Soon after, my father grew weak.
It looks like Dumas and Murat stayed close, at least to a certain extent. I mean, that's what I'm getting from this. I mean, two cavalry guys, right? I'm not sure what their relationship was. We haven't really covered it, but the fact that they seem to have kept up is maybe a positive sign. It seems like, Dumas on his way out. Which means that his son, Alexandre Dumas, same name as his father, just minus the Thomas, didn't really know his father that well.
Weaker, went out less often, rarely mounted a horse, stayed more in his room, took me on his knees with greater sadness. In 1806, Thomas-Alexandre Dumas died of stomach cancer. His family sank into poverty. Marie-Louise wrote incessantly to Napoleon concerning the military pension owed to widows of generals. A sympathetic general finally mentioned her case to Napoleon directly. The emperor stomped and said, "I forbid you ever to speak to me of that man."
Yeah. To be fair, I think as Napoleon went on, some of his magnanimity that he may have had in his earlier years began to disappear, and the grudges he held grew over time. Not to mention, like we said, he became more conservative over time, more self-interested, I would say, more narcissistic. I know that's difficult. He was always very narcissistic. I don't know if race played a role in this, but he certainly became more racist over time. So maybe that was a part of it too.
Marie-Louise took a job in a tobacco shop, all the while struggling to support the young Alexander. She often spoke to him of his father, the stories of his Herculean exploits in battle.
Yeah.
General Thomas-Alexandre Dumas had lived in a season of revolution.
Yeah, certainly an accomplished fellow. I mean, we've seen that throughout this video. A great warrior, a leader, but certainly seems like there was missed potential there. And, his disagreements with Napoleon seem to have really hampered his career. Though that's true for several generals and military men of this era. If you spoke out against Napoleon or you didn't get along with Napoleon, then that would be real bad for your career progression in the future. Not to mention the time he spent in prison. Of course, that was missed time, and also he seemed to grow very weak during that imprisonment. So, very accomplished. A lot of fantastic stories, but still seems to me a lot of missed opportunity.
When men began to champion the idea of universal rights and liberty, he died in that vast chasm between their grand promises and bleak reality.
Very true.
The young Alexander became one of the most accomplished.
And, that's really where Haiti ended up, too. The vast gap between the promises of the revolution and the reality of the revolution. Like I said, at times, it really seemed like Haiti might be heading in a better direction. Maybe the promises of the revolution would be good for the colony of Haiti. Slavery abolished, the people free, liberty coming to the island. I think especially when Toussaint Louverture was in Haiti. There's good and bad. You can certainly debate. But he probably had the best opportunity to control the situation and lead Haiti forward with a partnership with the French government. But of course, Toussaint is brought back to France, imprisoned. Napoleon tries to turn the clock back on Haiti. they fight back, and it ends up in the position that it ended up in, right? And it also ends up ostracized, honestly, from many other countries around the world, very mistreated. And even today, Haiti faces a lot of issues, a lot of poverty, and a lot of that comes from the history of the country, right? How it began and the ostracization it faced.
Novelists in history. In sprawling adventures, he imagined a world not so unlike the one for which his father had fought.
Didn't seem to know his father that well, or at least not for many years, but certainly seems to have been inspired by the memory and probably the experiences he did have of his father.
A world where villainy was met at every corner with justice and truth.
Alright. Very cinematic end.
If you really appreciate the content we're putting out.
Yes, and so go and check out this video by History Dose. Fantastic video. It's linked down below. You can subscribe to them, check out their Patreon. Give them some support. This was a pretty long video, 37 minutes, but really high quality. A lot of good content packed in to that time. Great art, great storytelling, great voiceover, all that kind of stuff. Fantastic video. I really enjoyed this one, I don't know too much about Dumas in particular, but I think his story is a fascinating one. And, when we look at an individual person during a time like this, or really any time, but especially a time of great change, we can sort of follow the trends and events of the era through this individual. And so, looking at Dumas, we can follow the French Revolution. We can look back to Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, even though he left. Of course, he very much has an attachment to Haiti. We can look at the path that Napoleon took. There's a lot of different things we can look at that Dumas was a part of, right? A lot of things that, I would love to do other videos on. Napoleon's time in Egypt, fascinating. Haiti, I don't think we've done really much on Haiti on this channel. But yeah, that's a fascinating topic as well. We got a chance to talk about it a bit in this video, but a lot of fascinating stuff. Dumas, a real interesting character. In some ways, a bit of a melancholy story, because it seems like he was mistreated. He didn't really get maybe the health and long life he might have deserved, right? But, at least we have his son, who would seemingly go on to remember his father and be inspired by him for many of his stories. So that's something, at least. I had a good time with this one. This was a long reaction, so if you made it this far, thank you very much. Hey, leave a comment down below letting me know you made it this far. I'll be very impressed. I had a good time with this one. If you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe, check out the Patreon, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.